Guten Abend, wir sind vom Verein Bitcoin Austria und heute sind wir bei der Kapitalbank zu Gast. Und das Thema des heutigen Abends ist, ein Buch vorzustellen vom Saifedean Ammous, das zusammen mit dem Nikolaus Jilch dann besprochen wird. Also recht herzlichen Dank, dass sich alle hier Zeit genommen haben, heute Abend bei uns vorbeizuschauen. Ein paar Worte über unseren Verein.
Yeah, hello everybody. We start a few words in German and switch over to English. My name is Johannes. I'm right now president of Bitcoin Austria. Bitcoin Austria was founded in 2011. We were a little group at that time, time passes on now. We have our 7th birthday. In the early days, we were downstairs somewhere in a nerdy cellar. 2018, we have this great location here. I want to say thank you very much that we can use this, be here, and a few words.
Ja, danke vielmals. Mein Name ist Constantin Veyder-Malberg und ich bin nicht der Einzige mit Krawatte hier, was mich wirklich freut. Ich bin Vorstand der Kapitalbank und als solcher bin ich klassisch Old Economy, aber man muss sich immer an neue Themen orientieren und das ist der Grund, warum wir sehr gerne hosten heute hier in unserem Palais Esterhazy im Empire-Saal diese Veranstaltung. Diese Veranstaltung ist uns deswegen wichtig, weil Nummer 1, wir mit der Community zusammenkommen. Wir kommen dadurch mit Bitcoin in Berührung, dass wir diejenigen, die Bitcoins früh gekauft haben und teilweise einen Exit schon gemacht haben, prüfen dann, ob sie ehrliches Geld erworben haben, weil das ist ehrlich gesagt einer der Kernprobleme in der Schnittstelle zwischen Zahlungsmitteln, die gesetzlich sind, und anderen Währungen. Das ist eines der Hauptthemen mittlerweile für uns als reguliertes Bankwesen und da haben wir uns sehr stark spezialisiert in dem Thema und haben da schon einiges gemacht und das ist auch der Grund, warum wir mit Bitcoin Austria immer wieder gerne zusammenarbeiten und heute Abend das hosten. Der Saal, in dem Sie sich hier befinden, ist in einer Phase entstanden, als wir noch eine Art Goldstandard hatten. Es ist nicht nur das Gold an den Wänden, sondern es war damals die Basis für die Währung. Und das finde ich auch die spannende Thematik heute Abend, dass wir wieder darüber reden. Die Frage wird sein, ob die Währungen mit einem anderen Standard unterlegt sein werden und ob das immer noch Gold sein wird. Und deswegen bin ich sehr gespannt, wie dieser Abend verlaufen wird. Danke vielmals und ja, ich freue mich auf spannende Diskussionen.
Für die einzelnen Worte.
Nikolaus Jilch von der Presse, freut mich sehr, schönen guten Abend. Ich mache jetzt die Anmoderation auch noch kurz auf Deutsch und der Rest des Abends, den machen wir dann auf Englisch. Wie wir schon gehört haben, unser Stargast heute, Saifedean Ammous, ist Assistenzprofessor für Wirtschaft an der Lebanese American University und Foreign Member Columbia University Center on Capitalism and Society, Bitcoin Standard, das Buch. Er hat mir, ich muss jetzt die traurige Nachricht überbringen, es ist zwar heute der erste Tag seiner Buchtour, die ihn durch mehrere europäische und amerikanische Länder führen wird, aber die Bücher hängen im Zoll fest. Es gibt also heute Abend keine Bücher, man kann sie aber im einschlägigen Buchhandel kaufen, vielleicht machen wir auch eine Bestellliste, wir werden das sicher irgendwie lösen. Kurz zum Ablauf des Abends. Saif wird sein Buch und seine Gedanken zum Bitcoin-Standard kurz vorstellen, 10, 15 Minuten. Dann werde ich ihn joinen hier auf der Bühne, werde ihm ein paar Fragen stellen, wir werden uns kurz unterhalten und alle Fragen, die ich dann noch nicht gestellt habe, die dürfen Sie dann stellen in der letzten und hoffentlich spannendsten Phase, wenn wir das Mikrofon durchgehen lassen. Jetzt halte ich Sie auch gar nicht mehr länger auf, weil Sie sind nicht hier, um mich zu sehen. Mr. Saifedean Ammous, welcome to Vienna. It's very nice to have you, and I'll give you the stage.
Thank you very much, everybody, for hosting me, and thank you to Bitcoin Austria and to National Bank. It's really a pleasure to be in Vienna, particularly a pleasure for me, for those of you who've read my book, because I'm extremely influenced by Austrian economists. And that's why I insisted on trying to make this the first stop on my book tour. So the topic of my book is Bitcoin. And in particular, it's about the idea that Bitcoin is emerging as a new monetary standard. Bitcoin is becoming something like the gold standard. And that's why the title of the book comes from that, the Bitcoin standard, similar to the gold standard. So I'm not going to obviously summarize the entire book, but I'm just going to drop a few of the main ideas that I make in the book so that we can have an open discussion around them. The first concept that I discuss in terms of trying to understand what is it that makes Bitcoin money is to understand what is it that makes anything money. Why does money come around? And there's the first 7 chapters of my book do not even mention Bitcoin almost entirely because they discuss money in general. And we look at the history of money over time, what gets chosen as money, what stops being used as money, why do things go from being used as money to stopping being used as money. And I think, in my opinion, the argument that I make is that the most important factor that determines whether something can be used as money today or in the last couple of thousand years is the fact that it is hard to produce. If something is easy to produce, people use it as money, others will produce more of it, and then the price of it will come crashing down, and then it becomes a useless store of value. If it's hard to produce, people use it as money, they store their value in it, the price goes up, it's hard for others to produce more of it and then bring the price down. So this is why, if we look historically, we find that the best forms of money were always the hardest to make. In places where seashells were rare to find, rare seashells were used as money. In places where cattle, initially was used as money because it's hard to make. If we look at limestones or all sorts of things that, in any particular location, were used as money, there was always a way, or a physical or a political mechanism of restraining the supply growth. That's really the key point. And whenever we find an example of several forms of money interacting, usually what ends up happening is, or almost always what ends up happening is, what survives as money is whatever is hardest to produce. Because if you have several forms of money interacting with one another, then people who store their money in the money that is easy will lose all of their wealth over time because the money continues to get produced more and more of it, and then the supply of it increases, and so the value drops. So historically, we find that gold became money for this very important reason, which is that the supply growth of gold is the lowest of all the metals because, number one, it's very rare in earth, but even more importantly, gold does not ruin, and because it doesn't ruin, that means that the current supply that we have around the world has been stockpiled over thousands of years. And so even if production were to increase next year, it will only be a small little fractional addition to all the thousands of years of stockpiles that we've piled up. In other words, the potential for the supply of gold to grow as a response to increased demand for gold is the lowest of all other metals. Therefore, it's a hard money. Therefore, gold was the hardest money that humanity had ever had because the supply grows every year at around between 1% and 2%. That's it. No matter what happens to the gold price, the mining output of gold is always around 1 or 2% of stockpiles. And that's what I think makes gold money over many, many years, because nobody could ever guarantee such a low supply growth. Now, if we move and look at government monies, we find the same story. Currencies whose governments print a lot of them, whose supply increases a lot, they lose their value quickly. And then people move towards the harder currencies whose supply increases less and less. So the main currencies of the world, like the dollar and the euro and the Swiss franc, and the most commonly used around the world, you find that the annual supply growth of these currencies is around 3% per year, 5%, 7%, something like that. Whereas, the currencies that are always witnessing crises and inflation, you find that the supply growth there is 10, 20, 30, 50, maybe even much more. And so we have this dynamic over time always, and it's partly due to human psychology that people can recognize that gold is a better store of value than copper, but it's also not just human psychology, it's also natural market selection. It's just people who choose the better money end up with more wealth in the long run. People who choose the worse money end up with less wealth in the long run. Enter Bitcoin. Why is Bitcoin important here? Because Bitcoin has, in the next few years, in about 4 or 5 years, Bitcoin will have the lowest supply growth of anything that has ever been used as money. And it will be reliably lower. Right now, the supply growth of Bitcoin is around 4% per year, which is a little bit more than double of the supply growth rate of gold. But in about 4 or 5 years, it'll drop below that, and then the supply will continue to grow at a lower rate until it stops completely. Why I think this is very important is because this is the reason that Bitcoin won't go away. There are a lot of good reasons, I'm sure many of you have heard, for why Bitcoin is bad. Bitcoin is evil, it consumes a lot of electricity, it's bad for the children, and it's bad for everything. I'm sure you've read the newspapers and you know all the stories. And yet it refuses to go away. Why? In my opinion, because it's very good money. It's very hard money. It's harder money than all the other kinds of monies. And people are just not going to give it up. People might pretend that they will give it up, but people understand that the hardness of it makes it more valuable to hold than currencies that increase every year by 10% in their supply. So if you extrapolate Bitcoin's supply 50 years from now, Bitcoin's supply will grow at about only another extra 20% over the current supply of Bitcoins. Whereas if you extrapolated the euro or the dollar or the yen or any of these currencies over the next 50 years, just by extrapolating what happened over the last 20 or 50 years or whatever, you're going to get several multiples. You know, you're going to get 500%, 600%, 1,000% multiple of the current supply. So thinking of it in the long run, this is an enormously important factor, and I think more and more people are going to wake up to it over time. And you know, the significance of this is that Bitcoin, in my opinion, is not really optional. You know, you can't just say, I don't like Bitcoin, and so I'm just going to keep using my money. There are a couple of stories that I include in my book about societies and what happened to them when a harder form of money entered them. So for instance, West Africa, they did not have manufacturing of glass beads very common. And so glass beads were used as money because they were very hard to make. But then when Western Europeans started traveling down to West Africa and saw that these glass beads were used as money, they would go back to Europe, fill up an entire boat with these glass beads, and then transport it down to West Africa and use it to buy things in West Africa. Eventually, those beads came to be known as the slave beads because it was a way for Europeans to just keep buying everything that the Africans had with them, while the value of the money that the Africans had collapsed. In other words, you know, the Africans couldn't have just said, you know, we don't believe in gold as money and we don't like gold, we prefer glass beads because we've always had glass beads. And because if your money is easy, the people who use harder money, the people who use gold, will find it trivial to make more of your glass beads and then to come and bring them to Africa and use them. And this, I think, is part of the significance of why Bitcoin matters, the hardness of the money. And the fact is that it is also the first strictly scarce liquid asset that we have ever had as human beings. So people talk about scarcity, but I think there's a little bit of a misunderstood element of it. People think in terms of, you know, the quantity of physical metals and resources on Earth is limited, and so everything is scarce. I don't think that's entirely accurate because it's immaterial what the amount of these metals is on Earth. The quantity of iron or copper or gold or oil or anything that we consume as a society is not limited by how much we have on Earth. It's limited by how much time we dedicate to it as opposed to the other needs. In other words, if the demand for copper increases drastically for whatever reason tomorrow, it won't be trivial for us to triple copper production next year and then to keep tripling it for a very long time. It'll be very costly in terms of other goods and services, but it won't be impossible. In other words, the limit on how much copper we have is not in the copper itself, it's in our time. So this, I think, is true of every resource, and I think, and I quote the economist Julian Simon, who's sort of an Austrian, but he's American, and he says, you know, the only real resource, the only scarce resource is human time, because that's the resource that can be used to make more of anything. Nothing else is scarce. Well, now, Julian Simon is not with us, but now we have one more thing that is also scarce like human time, which we cannot make more of no matter what, and that is Bitcoin. I mean, other than that, okay, there are things that we can't make more of. We'll never make another Mona Lisa, we'll never make one of those things, but these things are not liquid. These things are not things that you can use for payment. These things are not divisible and transportable and so on. But Bitcoin is the first liquid asset, or resource if you want, whose supply is truly and scarce, strictly scarce, as I like to call it in my book. And I think the significance of this is that when you understand that time is the only thing that's really scarce for us as human beings, and that money really is an attempt to save our wealth across time, or specifically to preserve the fruits of our labor from today into the future. Money is a technology, essentially, for making the fruits of our labor today available for us for future consumption. Now, you can think of the inflation of the supply of the money as being like an inefficiency in the engine of that technology. Because if you store your wealth in a money whose supply is limited, whose supply is increasing, your wealth is being drained out of that money that you stored it because the money supply is increasing. So now, finally, we have a liquid resource where you can store your wealth wherein nobody can increase the supply. And I think the implications of this are probably enormous. I mean, it means that productive labor can continue to be productive and that its product can remain and gain value into the future. And I think that's going to have very significant effects on how we live our lives, which brings me to the topic of the importance of sound money and the importance of hard money. In chapter 5 of my book, an entire chapter is dedicated to this question, and it's particularly about time preference. Time preference is how much human beings value the future versus the present. And so if you had no choice of saving, if you knew that your only medium of exchange was, let's say, a gas that would evaporate, so you can buy that gas and it will evaporate, you will be very unlikely to save. And if you're unlikely to save, you're unlikely to think of the future. And then all of your decisions as an individual will likely center around the present and around, immediate gratification. That's what we call high time preference behavior. As you're able to save, as you're able to think more of the future, you shift your thinking towards the future. That becomes low time preference behavior. And low time preference behavior is really what initiates the process of civilization, as economist Hans Hermann Hoppe likes to say. It's only when human beings begin to think of the future and begin to invest and begin to accumulate capital that we begin to develop the process of civilization, where we start thinking about what is better for the long run and not what is better for our immediate, animalistic needs right now, what we want right now. So I think this is really quite an important thing, and there's a long discussion in my book about the difference in the effect of changing time preference as opposed to the monetary medium. So for instance, if you look at 19th century Europe and you compare it to 20th century Europe, I don't think it's an entirely coincidental thing that, a lot of, say, the way that the music was, the way that the art has changed, the way that architecture has changed, the way that people's orientation, people's savings rates, people used to save a lot more back then than they do right now. And I think there are a lot of evidence to suggest that we're moving more and more towards a high time preference society because of the fact that the money continuously loses its value. Government money is continuously losing its value, which incentivizes people to think of the short term rather than the long term. So I think Bitcoin, the really interesting thing about it for me is that it probably will reverse that process. And those of you who start buying Bitcoin will probably identify with this. Our generation is not a generation that has grown up with a culture of saving. It's not a generation that has grown up with the idea that you keep part of your income. You just spend everything that you have, and when you have major expenses, you borrow, and then you spend the rest of your life in debt. That's high time preference behavior, because you're not saving, because you're continuously thinking about the present, and you're continuously burdening your future self. Now imagine if a society where money gains value every year by 5%. In about 15 years or so, 16 years or so, the value of your money will double. If the money loses value by 5% every year, in 15 years or so, the value of your money will drop by half. Now imagine you've moved from, you were living in either of those. Where are you more likely to save? Where are you more likely to think about the future? Obviously in the one where the money appreciates, because you think about every dollar that you have, this could be $2 in 15 years. Whereas when the money's going down, you think this is $1, it could be half a dollar in 15 years. Why should I keep it in my pocket? It's losing its value quickly. So this, I believe, is one very important implication of having this new monetary medium. Another one, I think, is that it offers us an excellent protection against government abuse, from confiscation of wealth, inflation, and so on. Specifically, Bitcoin as a, as a user technology for individuals, currently, yeah, some people will escape Venezuela with Bitcoin and that will save their lives. But I think in the long run, the deeper impact that it will have is that it is going to make it harder and harder for governments to finance their operations through inflation. Because citizens everywhere in the world are developing Bitcoin as an exit strategy. So if any government starts inflating its currency, Bitcoin is far more easily available and harder to crack down on than dollars or gold or other currencies. So I think this is going to limit the ability by which government can confiscate wealth. And thirdly, I think the main concept of my book is that how Bitcoin is developing is becoming more and more similar to the gold standard, in the sense that, and those of you who followed Bitcoin might be familiar with the story of Bitcoin scaling and Bitcoin growing. And there's a huge amount of drama about, Bitcoin can only process about 500,000 transactions a day. And that, unless Bitcoin's block sizes are doubled or increased, then it won't be able to grow. And if it doesn't grow, then it won't, if it doesn't have more transactions, then it won't be growing. But if you look over the last year, what has happened as the price of the transaction fees in Bitcoin has gone up, as the demand for Bitcoin transactions went up, yes, it did not kill Bitcoin. On the contrary, what emerged was second layer solutions, where now Bitcoin payments are being settled by Bitcoin payment providers or exchanges or gambling websites or any website that offers Bitcoin as a solution. What they have started to do is to batch all of their transactions with one another into fewer transactions, so that, in fact, today, a majority of transactions done in Bitcoin don't actually register on the blockchain. They're cleared on the blockchain. So, for instance, if you and I have an account in an exchange and I want to send you money from my exchange to yours, the exchange won't put the transaction usually on the blockchain so that I will have to pay the full transaction fee. They'll just move it on their own internal record from my Bitcoin account to yours. And then that's it. That's a transaction that has happened, but the Bitcoins are sitting there on their account under their name. And then at the end of every day or every week, they will batch all of their transactions with other exchanges, so that each Bitcoin transaction now is probably standing for 2, 3, maybe 4, maybe even 10 off-chain transactions. And that's exactly what the system was like under the gold standard. Under the gold standard, the actual physical movement of gold happened very rarely. For every ounce of gold that physically moved from one bank or one country to the other, you had thousands of transactions taking place with that 1 ounce, with pieces of paper and bank accounts and so on moving it. So I think the misunderstanding of the scaling of Bitcoin is that it has to happen on-chain, and I think on-chain scaling is completely impractical. Where it's going to be practical is that second and third layer solutions are going to be developed, where Bitcoin is going to be used for settlement. And this is really, I think, in my opinion, where Bitcoin's strength lies. It's not going to replace your Visa or MasterCard payments. It will have the Visa and MasterCard's payment put on top of them. If you compare your Bitcoin payment, it needs at least 10 minutes. It needs about 10 minutes to get one confirmation. In order for you to be sure of it, you need a few confirmations. That's 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 minutes. That's, that's no comparison to your credit card. And it's also no comparison for your credit card, because your credit card is not final settlement. You could still cancel it, and the guy could cancel it, and who knows what might happen. It takes weeks for the credit card payment to finally settle. But it shows up within seconds. So the comparison of Bitcoin payments is not to individual consumer payments. I think the valid comparison is between Bitcoin payments and interbank settlement payments, or between interbank gold settlement payments. And this, I think, is where Bitcoin's strength really lies. Because if you think of it, under the gold standard, the reason the gold standard eventually failed, and the reason it eventually was overtaken by government money, was the fact that gold clearance is highly centralized. At the end of the day, it's not cheap or easy or safe to move around big chunks of gold from one place to the other. However, if as the size of the economic transactions happening in gold continue to increase, more and more people started using second layer transactions, and that necessarily led to the centralization of all gold clearance into a few banks, and then eventually one bank in every country. And then that became very easy for government to take over, and then for government to move forward. So the difference then, and this is the key value addition of Bitcoin, is that it's like gold in that it's a final settlement clearance. It's like gold in that it is very hard money, but it's even harder. But what's even better about it than gold is that you can send it halfway around the world in under an hour for final settlement, for currently around $1 of transaction fees. Even if it goes up to $100,000 of a transaction fee to have a Bitcoin transaction on the Bitcoin network, that's still cheaper than sending large payments of gold halfway around the world, right? So when Germany tried to repatriate its gold from the Federal Reserve a few years ago, it cost a lot of money. So I think what this means is that what Bitcoin is going to offer us is not a new way of buying things cheaper. It's not going to reduce your credit card fees. It's going to offer us a new decentralized central banking system around the world, whereas instead of the current centralized system where we have one central bank for the entire world, I mean, we have several central banks, but let's face it, they all run on the dollar and they all run on the US monetary system. So instead of having one central bank responsible for pretty much all of the clearance of all payments around the world, we'd have thousands of central banks because they can all perform final clearance, because the Bitcoin network, even at current state, even without any improvements whatsoever, can undoubtedly do at least 500,000 transactions a day. So with 500,000 transactions a day, you could have thousands of banks around the world acting as central banks, providing final clearance, and running an entire monetary system independently of the banking system and allowing for payments everywhere around the world without having to rely on the government-run central banking system. It's a viable alternative to central banking, and this is a viable alternative that's only continuing to grow. And the main advantage that it has, which is the reason why people should take it seriously and stop dismissing it, is that it is harder money than anything that we've ever known, and certainly much harder than any of the monies that any of the central banks today are using. I think this is it, and we'll open it up for discussion now. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I very much enjoyed the book. I don't even know where to begin. Let's maybe start with, how did you come up with the idea of writing this book? How was the process that led you there? I mean, was there any point in time where you said, well, if I write this book, I'm always going to be the guy who wrote the Bitcoin book, and if it doesn't work out, people will know that I wrote that book?
Actually, I had not thought of that scenario, but it's I don't think it's not going to work out, let's be honest, because I don't. But who knows? No, I mean, the reason that I decided to write it was just because I'd been following it for so long, and everybody I know was, 2016 and 17, after 3, 4, 5 years of everybody I know laughing at me as, oh, that's the weird Bitcoin guy. 2015, 16, and 17 is when they all started wanting to become friends with me again, and even say, hey, tell me more about this Bitcoin thing. So you have to explain everything to everybody. And then you realize, maybe I should just write it down into an explanation. And initially, actually, I probably shouldn't be saying this in public, but my original plan was to just have a brief sort of 30-page book and to do an online course with it and, to have them both online. I wasn't planning on really doing a proper book, but I decided in February, I think it was, I decided I was going to do 1,000 words a day until I finished this. And I was doing about 1,500 on average. I ended up writing almost all of it in 2 months because all of this stuff has just been piling up in my mind and nobody was interested. But then when everybody was interested, okay, you people are interested? All right, here you go. There's 100,000 words for you. And I just couldn't stop writing, so it came out.
A very prominent part of your book is a very thorough critique of basically the whole institution of economics, connected to the central banks and the monetary policy. Before we dive into it, I want to ask you the reception you got from the mainstream, so to say. Did you expect that? I mean, what happened? You're very active on Twitter. What's the kind of feedback that you get?
Most of the mainstream has more or less been ignoring my book, and that's perfectly fine by me, because it's just going to be a waste of time to try and get into arguments with most people who are, decidedly set against Bitcoin. There's a large number of people who are just, at this point, becoming professional Bitcoin bashers. That's what they do. People like Nouriel Roubini, their entire life is just sit and talk about why Bitcoin's bad. And there's no point in having any sort of discussion with people who are just hell-bent on refusing this. So I have to say that the reason that I was just, if you've read my book, you'll know that it doesn't really pull punches. It's me just basically speaking my mind as if I was talking to some of my closest friends. And that's going to make a lot of people angry. And the reason I just decided that, I'm not going to be diplomatic about it is because this isn't a popularity context. I'm not running for election. I'm not trying to please everyone, and I'd rather just tell it like it is. And the people who are not going to be happy with it are not going to be happy with it, whether I'm nice to them or not. So I decided to take off the gloves.
You talked about Bitcoin being, a medium that you can save money in, but you also talked about the whole system of being an alternative to central banking. Mm-hmm. So 99% of the economists and people I talk to would tell me, I didn't even know that we were looking for an alternative. I understand, of course, where you're coming from, but if it's an alternative, it's also a danger, right? Where do you see the next step? Do you really think that we're going to wake up in 2 years and Bitcoin will be the world's money and everybody will be happy?
I hope so, but no. No, I don't think it'll happen in 2 years. There's a view within Bitcoin circles of something called hyper-Bitcoinization, which is our version of the apocalypse, but in a pleasant way. And when hyper-Bitcoinization happens, all of the other monies of the world just collapse, and everybody is begging for Bitcoin or trying to get their hands on Bitcoin. And there's no more any price of Bitcoin because all the other currencies are dead. And obviously
that's exactly what the gold bugs will tell you is going to happen tomorrow.
I know, yeah, exactly. And while it's definitely satisfying to fantasize about that, I think it's not a very realistic example of how it's actually going to happen. And I think I don't mention this scenario in my book because I don't think it'll happen. And I think it's far more likely that what's happening now is just going to continue to grow, and people will slowly come to understand that. So, Bitcoin has gone from a weird joke on the internet to being the money of nerds on the internet, and then some libertarians joined, and then now it's, investors are coming in and hedge funds are coming in, and soon more and more people are coming in. It won't be an overnight thing where one day we wake up and, okay, everybody's using Bitcoin. But what we have right now is the central banking system runs about 99.8% of all the monetary transfers in the world run through that. And then we have 0.2% being run on Bitcoin. 0.2% is very small right now. But, if demand for Bitcoin increases, more people want to play this game, more people want to hold it, there's no possibility, as I mentioned, for anybody to make more Bitcoin to satisfy those people. So the only way they can get more of it, or they can get their demand for it is satisfied, is through the price appreciating, which is going to attract more and more and more people. So the way that I see it is, it's likely going to take a long time, because the fundamental impediment to it is just, it's not easy for people to buy Bitcoin. I know many people who would like to buy in theory, but it's just not easy for them to buy, to find a place, to find a person. There isn't that infrastructure available all over the world. So it needs to spread out, it needs a lot more time. And I don't think it'll be sudden. I think it'll be more of a gradual transition. It's just, you could think of it as being similar to the newspaper versus internet change in the news industry. It's not like one day we woke up and all newspapers died. But over time, newspapers had to adapt, and they got online, and then their businesses became more online. Some of them couldn't adapt, went out of business. I think we're going to witness something more gradual like that. The Bitcoin economy and the Bitcoin standard and the alternative to the central bank will continue to grow on the side, laughed at and dismissed by the serious economists, and I think that's an excellent gift that they're giving us, because they could have easily killed Bitcoin in the first couple of years through 51% attacks or so on. Now it's probably too late, even if they were serious about it, but they're not even serious about it. So I think it's just going to continue to grow on the side until it becomes more and more normalized. Now, how long it takes, I really don't know. As Hayek says, you can't make set predictions in economics. You can maybe see pattern predictions, but putting dates, I wouldn't do it.
Before we go into the economics of Bitcoin or the Bitcoin market as it is today, maybe stick with the economics themselves, because what you're talking about here is basically turning the world on its head, right? We go from an inflationary monetary system to a deflationary monetary system. Is that even possible? I mean, one of the main features of an inflationary monetary system is that my wage, it rises every year. Not very much, but a little, like a tiny little bit. In a deflationary monetary system, it would have to fall, right? Or at least the option would have to be there, right? How is that even possible?
I don't think that the wage would fall in a deflationary monetary system. The raise that you would get is that your wage stays the same, but the prices rise. The prices fall. So effectively, your real wage increases.
But how about unions? I mean, how do you explain this to a union?
Well, I mean, the only reason this became a problem, and this is, I mean, if you read Keynes's theories, essentially all of the rationalization for it is, if you don't do what I'm saying, and it's almost, you can almost feel him saying, look, this is all stupid, and I know it, but if you don't do what I'm saying, then the unions will eat us all, and the unions will go communist. And the reality is the only reason this threat of the unions was there in the first place was because of the inflationary policies that they had adopted earlier. I mean, the inflation in Britain had started with World War I and all across Europe. And then after World War I, Britain refused to go back on gold at the old parity, and that's what made wages very low, and that's what made people demand higher wages. And so the way that they gave them higher wages was through inflation. And that's really, remove all of the smoke and mirrors of all the equations and the math and all of the complications that Keynes adds. This is it. This is all of what Keynesian economics is. How do we give the workers wages that are nice? Keynes just thinks workers care about numbers. They care about having more numbers. They want to see big zeros on their paycheck. They don't care about what it buys. So let's just print more money that gives them higher wages, and then we can, get back to equilibrium at a higher wage level and a higher price level. Well, you could do the same thing without having to inflate and get stuck on and have a lower wage level and a lower price level. So I don't really see that rationale. I mean, the example of the 19th century in Europe in particular, and in the US, which I talk about extensively in my book, shows you how the dangers of a deflationary economy are really not real. I mean, there's a reason this was called La Belle Époque in all over the world. This was, the time when modern civilization spread out the most all over the world. Things were pretty good at that time. Quality of life had improved most drastically all over the world. The spread of electricity and sewage and all of these things and the elimination of diseases. All of that happened under a monetary system under a monetary medium whose supply grew very slowly and much slower than the economy grew. It was not a problem because simply prices drop downward, people are able to afford more, and life gets better, and then that allows people to save more and accumulate more and more capital into the future.
Do you think that because you started off and you wanted to start in Vienna because you consider yourself an Austrian economist, right? And Austrian economists have been the few that I know have always been saying, that someday our time will come. I bet many have also written it and then died, and the time never came. Their work still ring true, which is important. Do you think that the monetary system, the easy money monetary system, has influenced or even corrupted the profession of economics? And do you think that a change to a hard monetary system that you were describing will change it in another direction?
Very much so, absolutely. I think I could have said that to your earlier question. The reality is, the reason it's pointless to address this towards the economics profession is, as I don't know who it was who said it, you can't convince a man of something if his salary depends on the opposite of it. So today, modern economics education is almost entirely financed and controlled by central banks all over the world. And this begins with the US, where the central bank in the US pays something like $4 billion a year to fund research and grants all over the universities. It's practically impossible to be a monetary economist in the US and not work with the Fed and not get funding from the Fed. I mean, there's probably less than 10 monetary economists in the entire US who are not, in one way or the other, reliant on federal funding. So, you know, you have to keep this in mind when you see all of these economists get on TV and talk about how Bitcoin is bad. Well, you know, this is like asking, you know, telegraph operators about what they think of the internet. It puts them out of a job specifically. And I think, you know, as somebody who started this, I was doing my PhD in Columbia University being taught by some of these high-profile professors that are now going on TV and bashing Bitcoin. I studied that stuff and I was doing my PhD in it, and it was not convincing. And having read the Austrian economics, I found it a much better way of understanding the world, and it's a much better way of understanding how the world is changing. And I think the reason Keynesian economics continues to survive has nothing to do with its validity, or has nothing to do with its, you know, its ability to explain events or its ability to change things. It's just simply what people in power want to hear. And Keynesian economics was not invented by Keynes. I mean, the US in 1931 and 1932 was already doing what we think of as Keynes's ideas. Keynes was just the man who came and put a book out there with his name that said, you know, this is what you should be doing, and then that gave them the intellectual justification for doing what they wanted to do. But, I mean, I think Bitcoin, were it to succeed, it's a small little moral victory, and it's going to be something that, you know, economists like me will enjoy a lot, but in the grand scheme of things, it doesn't really matter all that much. But yeah, one of the nice things that it'll do is hopefully it'll destroy the mess that is Keynesian and modern economics and return us to sound 19th century Austrian economics, hopefully.
You did also, you know, criticize monetarists because they, like Keynesians, argue for a management of the money supply. But didn't Milton Friedman is a famous monetarist, and he basically saw Bitcoin coming, didn't he?
Yeah, it's an interesting debate. There's an interesting discussion by Friedman where he discusses something like Bitcoin, but what he discusses is the cash aspect of Bitcoin. The idea that this is a currency online that you can use to pay other people untraceably without people knowing where it is and so on. And that's the interesting part about it. He did not discuss it from the perspective of a monetary system. From his monetary economics, Milton Friedman, I think, you know, is a much better propagandist than an economist. Or putting it another way, Milton Friedman, the propagandist, is a much better economist than Milton Friedman, the economist. Because Milton Friedman, the propagandist, talks about, you know, wage controls and minimum wage and price controls and how these things are bad. But Milton Friedman, the economist, spent 90% of his life talking about money with all of his phantasmagorical theories about money supply management and so on. And, you know, fundamentally, they all come down, all of his theories, even though he's heavily influenced by the Austrians, and he claims to be influenced by the Austrians, but fundamentally, all of his monetarist theories. And I think this is the only reason that you and I have heard of Milton Friedman, and he's not just some obscure American college professor in some little college in the middle of nowhere. The reason he became famous is because, you know, he was not going on. He said, we are all Keynesians now. You know, in the 60s, he said, nobody doubts the idea that the government should manage the money supply in order to do recovery. That's it. So he had to submit to that. He had to accept that. And all of his work in economics and, you know, his positivist stuff methodologically is completely worthless, obviously. All of that mathematics stuff that they do. As Austrians, we believe it's somewhere beneath astrology and somewhere near tarot cards in terms of its intellectual validity, with a much shorter track record than both. So obviously, you know, we can't really take that economic stuff seriously. And the results of it is just, I mean, you know, all of his economic ideas fundamentally come down to money supply management. One of his ideas was about, you know, setting a set growth rate for the money supply, that it would be algorithmic, but it would still be the government that controls it. So, you know, it's a complicated answer.
I mean, just to get this straight, do you really think that that when Bitcoin survives and thrives, that we do not need government fiat currencies at all anymore? Or is there a world where both can coexist peacefully?
I mean, they're coexisting peacefully so far. It could last for a while, but I think in the long run, I mean, money just wants to be one. I mean, money, there is absolutely no benefits from having two currencies in a single place. And if you look at any time when there has been more than one monetary medium in a place, the only reason that one survived is because of government enforcement. Like if you left on its own, the market will just choose one money. Like another example I talk about in my book is that by the end of the 19th century, almost everywhere in the world, gold was demonetized. Nobody was using, silver was demonetized. Nobody was using silver as money. Everybody was using gold because, thinking of it this way, you know, the world is much better if we all use one money than if half of us use one and then another half use another, because then there's more exchange. So naturally, we're going to tend towards having one money. Naturally, we're going to tend towards having the money that holds its value better. And nobody wants, you know, if you have the option of having a money that appreciates and an option of money that depreciates, people are very self-interested, and they will choose what they're self-interested. So I don't think this is sustainable as an equilibrium, in a sense.
But the system as we have it today, right now, so we have fiat currency in Europe. That is, I mean, we're not in Venezuela, we're not in Zimbabwe, so the inflation is bearable. Yeah. We have a very open and liberal gold market. I can buy physical gold anytime I want. Maybe blockchain will even follow that process. And then we have cryptocurrencies, especially Bitcoin. So if I want, I can put my money into appreciating assets, but I can also use depreciating assets for my everyday life. It's not so bad, is it?
No, it's wonderful. I love the fact that people will still accept the dollars that I have. It's great. For as long as people will do it, it's wonderful. But eventually, you know, they're going to wise up. Eventually, they're going to realize that this isn't a good deal. And people are going to start wanting less and less of the bad money. So I think, you know, it's a lose-lose situation for governments. If they just let the market decide, if they don't interfere and let the market decide, I think the market will just naturally lead to more and more economic activity being taking place in Bitcoin, because people will adopt it more, and also because the limited supply means it will just keep appreciating. On the other hand, if they try to fight it, if they make Bitcoin illegal, you know, this is the best thing that they could do for Bitcoin, because all that it does is, first of all, it'll demonstrate that they can't stop it. So, you know, people will wake up and they'll see, oh, our government has made Bitcoin illegal. Well, let's go on the internet and see what's happening with Bitcoin. And oh, look, every 10 minutes, a new block is being generated, as if our government doesn't matter. Hang on a second, maybe our government doesn't matter after all. So, you know, you won't be able to stop it. All that you'll do if you stop it is that you'll just show yourself as being completely impotent by trying to fight it, number one. Secondly, you're doing the best advertisement for it, which is if a government tells its banks, don't serve anybody who uses Bitcoin, don't let anybody use your accounts to buy Bitcoin, well, then everybody's just realizing, hang on a second, I have my money in the bank and you're telling me I can't buy this stupid digital toy if I want to buy it? That's not really very encouraging for me, keeping my money in your bank. So people will start maybe buying Bitcoin with their, you know, pocket change here and there and small amounts of money, but it's just proving the value proposition of Bitcoin as opposed to government money. So it's a war that I really can't see them winning against Bitcoin, and I think this is why, you know, when people talk about Bitcoin adoption, they think of it in terms of like the iPhone adoption. And, you know, will it be iPhone or Android or IBM or Apple or all of these things? And I don't think of it that way. I think it's a better example of understanding it is that it's like gunpowder. It's something that is not optional or, you know, a luxury or just something that you can afford to choose or not. For a government, I think eventually they're going to face the situation, whereas if you would like to continue to remain as a government, just like in the 19th century, the only way that you could survive as a government was if you had gold in your treasury, you're going to have Bitcoin. You're going to have to join it. And I think, you know, we don't know what's going on right now, but I think central banks might already be beginning to think about this, because it's, you know, if you can't beat them, join them. And And I think fundamentally, the problem with the sort of view that thinks that governments are just going to ban Bitcoin is that it assumes that all governments are one benevolent conspiracy of all these people sitting together every year and trying to make the world work better. In fact, governments are adversarial, and governments understand that they're competing against each other, and they understand they're looking for every little edge they can get against each other. And so governments will more likely understand the advantage that Bitcoin offers them, and will see the disadvantage that will come to them if they try to fight it. And I think over time, the fears of Bitcoin will become a little bit like the fears of the internet at some point. There was a time in 1995 where all that you heard about the internet was that it was just a place for horrible criminals and child porn and so on and so forth. And yet, the internet has outgrown that, and now nobody thinks of it as being just a place for criminals and bad people. And I think Bitcoin is likely to face that fate eventually.
I have so many questions, I don't even know where to start. No, I want to move into the question, but the one question that is on everybody's mind, I think, is why are you so sure it's Bitcoin? Yes, it was the first cryptocurrency, but there are many. When you buy Bitcoin cryptos today, it's easier than a couple of years ago, but it's also harder in the sense that you buy you put in some money, you buy half a Bitcoin, and then you have everybody screaming at you. You need to invest in Ethereum, you need to buy Bitcoin Cash, buy Ripple, everybody, even the media, the media is always to blame. The media tells you there are better projects than Bitcoin. But you seem to be sure that it's the one and the first Bitcoin that's going to take the spotlight forever instead of fiat currency, instead of gold. Why Bitcoin?
Well, it's not entirely just because it is first, although that's part of it. But the real reason is this. The value proposition of Bitcoin is not fast transactions. It's not allowing you to buy your coffee with, saving an extra cent that goes from your credit card to the company that processes it. Nobody is buying Bitcoin because they want to save on transaction fees. And this is not what's driving the growth. This is not what's driving the demand for it. The value proposition of Bitcoin, in my opinion, and I think time has borne this out, is the fact that the monetary supply for it is hard, is unalterable, and nobody can change it. So we're only going to have 21 million Bitcoin, and nobody can change that. And the reason I think Bitcoin became valuable, the reason the value continues to grow, is precisely because it's demonstrated its inability to change. It's demonstrated that nobody controls it. And that's a huge thing, because if there was one person out there who could decide that who could change Bitcoin, then everything I'm saying is completely useless. If tomorrow somebody comes up and says, hypothetically speaking, I have a magic switch that, or they had some malware in the code that everybody is running, and now he can control Bitcoin, forget everything I said, throw my book away and never talk to me ever again. It's gone. That's pointless. The only reason it matters is because nobody can change it. Nobody can change the supply. Nobody can change the new Bitcoin that are being produced. And we know this because people in Bitcoin, and some of the most influential people in Bitcoin, have spent the last 7-8 years going insane, trying to change some of the very small metrics of Bitcoin and completely failing at it. And this is what makes Bitcoin different. Bitcoin, in terms of the person who founded it, all of this perfect storm of somebody founding it, putting the software out there and then disappearing, and the software growing up on its own. I think a good example of it is to think of it as this, like a child that we threw in the jungle. Most likely, if you throw a 1-year-old in the jungle, he'll die. But if he survives, you're gonna have a massive monster. He's gonna be very powerful, and he's not gonna be able to stop. Now, you can't just bring another kid his age, who's now 20 years on, who's lived in a city, and then tell him, go spend a couple of weeks in the jungle and then go fight this guy. It doesn't work that way, right? And all these other coins are exactly like that. All these other coins, it's completely trivial for all the ones that I've ever heard of or researched. There's more than 1,000 of them, and I highly urge you to never waste any time on any of them. But for those of you who had the misfortune of wasting time on these coins, it's completely trivial to identify 2 or 3 people or 1 person for each one of those coins who could literally change whatever they want in that coin within a week. So for instance, Ethereum, there's an Ethereum Foundation. And it's completely trivial for them to change anything in Ethereum, as has been demonstrated over and over and over with all the hard forks that they've done. Ripple is just a centralized, stupid game, and there's a bunch of people running it with their own token. They can do whatever they want with it. They've printed 100 billion, and they have 60 billion on the side that they can do whatever they want with. So, you know, I could keep going on and on. Name any particular coin.
What about Bitcoin Cash?
Exactly, Bitcoin Cash, another excellent example. I mean, the people who started it were people who started it by changing the Bitcoin software. So they started from the perspective of saying, hey, this isn't something that is sacred, this isn't something that is immutable, we can change it. So if you can change it to make the block size larger, it'll be trivial to change it to make the money supply grow. But if the money supply can grow and change, then the entire value proposition of the thing is gone. And so, you know, the onus of proof is not on Bitcoin to say why it is better than the others. The onus of proof is on all these other coins that are effectively nothing but scams to enrich the people who have made them, to illustrate to others why is it that they can claim to be immutable. You have a foundation and you have a guy who has spent millions, you know, you're financed by bankers who have given you millions and press releases and all of those people. You know, these coins didn't just come out of nowhere. People spent millions on making them happen. Why did they spend those millions? Not for charity and not because they want a digital currency to be available, because if they wanted one, there's already Bitcoin out there. The only reason they made it is so that they could get rich off of it, and they continue to control it. Now, how can they demonstrably prove or illustrate or credibly show that they can't change the supply? That's the question that any other coin would need to answer before I can take it seriously. And the reality is none of them can do it. And the point is, if none of them can do it, if none of them can demonstrate it, then there's no point behind having this entire blockchain structure and all that expensive stuff. Just have a centralized currency. There's nothing wrong with centralization. Have a centralized currency and let it compete with Bitcoin. It will be more efficient, it will be faster.
Isn't that something that you would expect from the central banks, that they would have centralized currencies to compete with Bitcoin?
Yep, they've been doing it for more than 100 years. That's what they have, centralized currencies that are competing now badly with Bitcoin. So, I mean, I think there will be centralized competitors to Bitcoin. That's perfectly fine. I think Bitcoin will win not because it's decentralized. It will win because it's harder. But decentralization and the lack of a central controlling party is what makes this hardness completely, you know, just set in stone. You don't have to worry. You don't have to follow Bitcoin news to find out what's happening if they're going to increase the inflation. If you have dollars, you have to follow Ben Bernanke and all of those people and what they're doing and whether they're increasing the supply. And if you buy any other altcoin, then yeah, you need to always follow what they're doing. But with Bitcoin, you know, get your private key, store your Bitcoins. 20 years from now, you know, if you own, you know, 1/1,000,000 of all the Bitcoins that exist, 20 years from now, you'll still own 1/1,000,000 of all the Bitcoins that exist. That is something that no altcoin can claim. So then altcoins just continue then, and you know, what they have as their selling points are just a bunch of marketing talking points. You know, all these apps and all these things that are supposed to be developed over blockchain technology that people have been talking about for 8-9 years, none of which is coming through.
I think Ben Bernanke has actually been in retirement for a couple of years, but but do you I mean, that would be maybe my last question. You do realize that in a world where central banks, like in extremis, where central banks print fiat currency to buy Bitcoin on the open market, we will see Bitcoin prices that will, you know, eye-watering Bitcoin prices. And then we have people who today own 10,000, 100,000 Bitcoins, and most of the vast majority of people don't own any Bitcoin. So how do you answer the already sounding question in my head, how about the inequality in the Bitcoin system?
I think Bitcoin is going to be an excellent solution to the problem of inequality in the world global system, not as it is understood by the sort of, you know, the Marxist take on inequality, which is simply, as I like to call it, it's anytime you see an economist who studies inequality, you remember this is the child who used to always want to play with other people's toys, no matter how many toys they had. They were the ones who were always unhappy with their own toys. So I don't mean inequality in terms of who has more toys. I don't think that is a problem that needs to be solved. I think, you know, if you have a child who's always looking at other people's toys, the problem is not getting them more toys, the problem is changing their attitude. Or the solution is not getting them more toys, the solution is changing their attitude. And I think what Bitcoin is going to do is going to solve the problem of inequality that is government mandated. The fact that some people don't produce anything of value and yet continue to get money because they have access to the money printers. Whereas other people continue to produce things of value and yet they continue to witness their wealth dissipate because the money printers are devaluing their wealth. So Bitcoin, once the supply is set, or even when most of the supply is there, the only way of making Bitcoin is to do something productive for other people. And so, initially, forget about the initial distribution for a minute, and I'll get back to that. But in the long run, eventually, the only people who will have Bitcoin will be people who are productive. And it doesn't matter how many Bitcoins you hold today. If you got lucky and you mined 1,000 or 100,000 Bitcoin in 2009 or 2010. It won't matter eventually. Well, as the price rises, you're going to be spending. You're going to be spending these, and that's going to be decreasing the amount of Bitcoins that you have. And eventually, your Bitcoins will only stay with you if you're able to be productive, if you're able to produce things of value. Now, on terms of the initial distribution, I think the solution to that is prices. As the price rises, the people who have 1,000 Bitcoin, they become more and more likely to sell. Bitcoiners obviously always joke about, we'll never sell our Bitcoin and hodl to death and hodls for 10 generations. But let's face it, if you bought some Bitcoin for $100 and now they're worth 3 times your annual salary and you're having problems paying off your mortgage or something like that, and your Bitcoins are continuing to appreciate, you are going to sell. Everybody's going to sell. And, people might not like to talk about it on Twitter, but they will sell eventually, and that's perfectly normal.
The one thing that immediately came to mind when I read your chapter about time preference and saving is that the hodl meme actually shows that the people who invest in Bitcoin, they have time, they can wait. Many of them, because I mean, would you agree that the people? It seems like it's this whole speculation thing, but it actually started out with people who actually just wanted to wait and see what happens.
Yes, and so it's about time preference fundamentally. I mean, the people who are, it doesn't matter how many Bitcoins you own. I mean, I've known people who had thousands and hundreds of thousands of Bitcoin, and they sold them or lost them, or because they couldn't really see the value in the long run. In the long run, the people who are going to hold on to their Bitcoins and keep them are the ones who value them the most and the ones who are able to wait the longer. So it's a matter of time preference. But time preference, it can be low or high, but it is never zero. There's nobody in the world who values things, who values things today equally to what they are 10 years or 20 years from now, because you could be dead 10 or 20 years from now. So you prefer present consumption. Everybody is like that. And, people get married, people want to buy homes, people want to...
Get divorced.
Get divorced, exactly. That will take care of a lot of these things. And also, a lot of people will lose their coins. I think people are dismissing that. A lot of people lose a lot of coins. People die without having a good backup, and then the coins are gone.
The most amazing thing, and that's my last statement, and I'm gonna open up the floor. The most amazing argument I read about Bitcoin being a positive thing is that now, if you adopt it in a third world country, in Zimbabwe or in Venezuela, and if only half of what you're saying comes true, we have a solution for the refugee problems, because people will be so rich in Africa that they don't want to come to Europe anymore.
I mean, that whole Bitcoin solves everything meme, I think.
No, just for Zimbabwe, not for the rest of the world.
There's this tendency to market Bitcoin as a little bit more than what it is, and it's kind of hard because Bitcoin is so mind-blowing, and for the first few years you're just so taken by it when you start understanding it. But no, if you're not a productive person, and if you're poor and you're not working, Bitcoin is not going to magically change the world so that unproductive people become wealthy. It's not a solution to all of life's problems. The idea that, Africa's just going to overnight become wealthy. I'm not going to stand here and sell you these fictions that, buy Bitcoin so that you save Africa. I mean, obviously, part of Africa's problems obviously have to do with unsound money and with government control of money and hyperinflation. That's a big part of it. That's a big part of the problems everywhere in the world. Obviously Zimbabwe would be much better off if they didn't have all of these things. But I would not stand I can't really just say that it will solve everything. No, it's just a form of money, but I think it's a form of money that provides much better economic incentives for people to be productive rather than being extractive. Perfect. Thank you very much. We already have our first question. We have, I think, 1, 3. Okay, we'll start over there.
My question is on the problem or on the issue on anonymity. We already had this split in the Bitcoin community with the block size debate, which might to some seem like a controversial issue, but in my notion, we might have the same split or like a worse split again once we talk about merging anonymity techniques into Bitcoin.
I'm sorry, merging what?
Anonymity mechanisms, because they tend to be more controversial. What do you think about this? Is this going to lead to another split, or is it even important?
I don't think it would lead to a split, because the way that Bitcoin's incentives work are such that you're really very strongly incentivized to stay on the main chain, because defecting is highly costly. And I think Bitcoin Cash, in fact, the success of the Bitcoin Cash split you might argue that, okay, that shows that we can have more splits. I'd say it would be the opposite, because Bitcoin Cash had something like, 80 or 90% of manufacturers of mining equipment behind it, and it had a lot of old-time Bitcoiners and a lot of resources, and yet it struggles to hold 10% of the Bitcoin price, So, if this is the definition of success of a split, this is only going to make it less likely for people to want to split. And I think in the future, people are going to want to stick to whatever is most likely to not cause a split. So this is just in general on the split issue. Now, in terms of the anonymity, I'm not entirely sure how things are going to evolve, but I'm not entirely sure that anonymity is going to be feasible on the first layer of the blockchain. It's just, at the end of the day, you see the transactions, every single transaction is there, and then blockchain analytics, they can't prove that this coin is yours, but sometimes they can, sometimes they can't, but there's a lot of headway to be made just by observing the public data on the blockchain, and it's only going to get better with time as we identify more coins and identify more addresses and so on. So anonymity, in my opinion, I don't think is going to be very feasible to achieve on the blockchain level. And this is one of the reasons why I think, all of these anonymity coins like Zcash and Monero are extremely misguided in their technique, because, a blockchain is a permanent record. That's the last thing you need to do, if you want something to be anonymous, It's a record that continues to exist there. So, you're starting at a severe disadvantage. If your goal is anonymity, don't start with a blockchain. Don't start with a centralized system where every transaction is recorded, because that makes it very easy to track back. So then adding anonymity onto the blockchain, I think, is going to likely be hard. But I think the possibility for it is going to be on second and third layers. And this is, to go back to the issue of my book, I think, in fact, the lack of anonymity in Bitcoin might actually be a good thing if you think of it as the Bitcoin blockchain itself as a settlement layer. Well, then the transparency would be ideal. Maybe the best thing to do is we have, say, 5,000 central banks around the world, and all of their transactions on the Bitcoin blockchain, they're the only people who deal on Bitcoin, the blockchain, because you and I can't afford the transaction costs. They do all of their transactions on it, and everybody knows all of these things. But then you can have your own bank account at an anonymous bank, and that bank just simply doesn't disclose your own data, and that's it. They do all of their payments on second layers, and I think the market is perfectly capable of providing genuine privacy solutions on second layers, particularly after everything we've been hearing over the last couple of years. I think this, this is a great opportunity for Bitcoin payment processors to offer themselves as second layer anonymity. Come and get an account with us and nobody will ever find out, as opposed to all of the current government influenced tech companies that are just always using their data to spy for the sake of government.
Thank you very much. Yes.
Okay, so first of all, I think you made some good analogies between multiple projects competing under different governance schemes that you outlined, like centralized organizations with single leaders or decentralized organizations. I think just like Bitcoin is competing with the classical monetary system, Bitcoin has to compete in a sense of governance models competing against each other, and we will see which will be the one who follows through. So in your last answer about anonymity, of course fungibility is a great positive factor for any currency. There are a lot of doubts that a second layer solution can really provide all these benefits without going through some serious slippery slopes. So a second layer solution, for example, in the past, we had the gold standard, of course, and the second layer solution was to the classical banking system as Giralgeld, money that was issued by private banks. So everybody was still thinking they are on the gold standard, whereas on their second layer they really weren't anymore. Yeah? So and in the Bitcoin system we had a very similar slippery slope when before Mt. Gox went down. People were upset with the 10-minute intervals and they started to accept Mt. Gox codes instead of real Bitcoins. So I think most of the second layer solutions that I have seen, or actually all of them, have great potential for them to be a substitute for on-chain payments. And on-chain payments today defines the value of a Bitcoin, because I'm only accepting a payment in Bitcoin today with an on-chain payment. But if I would accept a payment, for example, as a database entry at the provider, then this provider would immediately get the power to print more Bitcoins, basically to bring more Bitcoins into circulation and thereby diluting the money supply. So do you think this is a real potential that second layer solution will actually bring a dilution of the money supply and bring the same problems that we had back in the gold standard back into Bitcoin?
This is an excellent question, and it's not one that I can obviously answer directly. I can't say yes or no because we're going to have to find out over time. But here's the sort of counterpoint for why I think it won't be as big a problem on Bitcoin as it was on gold. Because of the fundamental nature of the blockchain where all of the coins are known. So if you're thinking about second layer solutions, you know, the payment provider will have a public address that is known. So then you know, compare that to the situation of a bank that has a vault that you can't check and you don't know how much gold they have there, but they're issuing notes and issuing notes for circulation. So the advantage, of course, is Bitcoin. You can track all of the Bitcoins and you can know how much Bitcoins they have in cold storage, and then you can see what their notes are circulating, how many notes they have. So that would allow people to first know if this is going to happen or not. Now, some of the pro-fractional reserve banking economists will tell you that they would expect this to develop on Bitcoin and that it is no problem. My feeling is that no, it won't develop simply because if you were a second layer solution provider and you started providing your inflated Bitcoin, like let's say you have 100
loans or fractional reserve, right?
Like let's say I have 100 Bitcoins in cold storage, but I have liabilities of 110 Bitcoin. A little bit higher than all of the assets that I have. As soon as you do that, your Bitcoins will start trading at a discount compared to regular Bitcoin because there's going to be more of them, and people will start accepting them at a discount. You know, if you're paying from that bank, your Bitcoin from that bank is 0.9 Bitcoins. You see, so I think this is just going to defeat the purpose. What's the purpose of printing 10% more Bitcoin if they're going to have 10% less value? So I think Mt. Gox was great in that sense because it taught people that lesson. Don't accept zero confirmation transactions and don't accept second layers as being as good as the first layer. Always verify. If you're going to accept second layer payments, always do them from somebody who's been thoroughly trusted and verified and you know, audited and so on. So I think over time, you know, the market is capable of providing those solutions. And I think the decentralized nature of Bitcoin compared to gold will likely mean that it's far less likely for any one entity, like the government, to step in and just say, okay, we are going to print Bitcoin 2, and you're going to accept it on par with Bitcoin. I can't really see that happening in the digital world because they can't put a gun to you in the digital world. You can just log on to another website.
Yeah. I mean, as an analogy, today Coinbase and BitPay I would today, possibly other people too, would accept a BitPay coin that they would vouch for. I can always spend it at their merchants, and it will be worth 1 Bitcoin. Maybe if it confirms instantly, then that's an advantage. But I think BitPay knows that this is a slippery slope and doesn't do it. And also they would fall into tons of regulation. So I think this is a great debate to have and a very important debate to have. And I don't think we can answer it fully today. So I think this is a good thing to keep in debate.
Absolutely,
so
I agree
I'm
entirely.
passing on the mic.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi, this was an incredible talk. I really enjoyed it, and I want to thank the host here. The venue is incredible, and I'm enjoying the fresco of trade as it was in the time of, I guess, the Greeks or the Romans. Because part of what you discussed, and this is something that I think about quite a bit also, is adoption. And so the way that you framed it in terms of our psychology, current state in terms of people needing to find cash, and then they have this alternative. But by any chance on Monday at Consensus in New York, did you have a chance to listen to the St. Louis chair speak about his view on Bitcoin?
No.
I'd encourage you. Because this is the first instance that I can recall that someone from the Fed actually made a statement publicly. And in it, he talks about innovation, and he talks about Bitcoin being actually a healthy thing in the economy. So I encourage everyone to go to YouTube and dial it up, because it was quite a fascinating speech. But it is very much in line with this idea of adoption. So that was it.
Thank you. Maybe I'd like to add something, because we started with Austrian economics. It was actually the European Central Bank in their first paper about Bitcoin in 2012. They already explained it with Austrian economics, and it was amazing. It's amazing to read it because you can literally see the economists like writing. We've been looking for an explanation in our books, and we couldn't find any until we found those weird people from Austria, and here is an explanation of who they are and what they think about.
Yeah. I mean, let's, we give these people a lot more credit, but according to Keynesian and Marxist theories, money is a product of the state, so Bitcoin shouldn't exist. The mere fact that anybody in the world accepts Bitcoin, and the fact that, people sit and talk about it and treat it like it actually exists, flies in the face of all their theories, because in their theories, some people even believe that the only reason gold is money is because government made coins out of gold, which of course is the other way around. They could have made coins out of something cheaper if the whole point was just having the picture of the king on it. Why not just make it with something cheap? Obviously, it was the other way around. And I think the emergence of Bitcoin is a huge slap in the face of that theory, of the idea that money is just what the state accepts for taxes. In fact, as some governments are beginning to accept Bitcoin and taxes, we're seeing how the state theory of money is completely in reverse. The market chooses the money. Government will then have to accept it.
Please.
Yeah, thanks. Like you, I also think there's a high probability that Bitcoin will be the crypto standard store of value. But I'm not as dismissive as you is on the other currencies, on the other crypto assets. You mentioned how Bitcoin is impossible to change, and you mentioned how Bitcoin Cash was changing a lot. But I think just like Bitcoin Cash increased the block size, Bitcoin just chose to implement SegWit instead. So that was also a change of the protocol, and I think we will also see more changes in the future of the Bitcoin protocol. And then right now, Bitcoin is about 40% of the market value of all crypto coins. So if we look 10 years into the future, what probability in percentage would you put on this being the same or higher for Bitcoin in 10 years?
So in terms of Bitcoin changing for SegWit, the key distinction is that SegWit is a soft fork, which means that if you adopt SegWit, you would still be compatible with nodes that didn't adopt it. In other words, if you're running Bitcoin, if you were running your software from 2 years ago, you haven't touched it, you haven't upgraded it, and you ran it today, it would sync with the Bitcoin network, not with the Bitcoin Cash network, even if you are not using SegWit, right? So SegWit is essentially a user-based upgrade because it requires nothing of the network. You're still in sync with the network. You can still sync with the network without the rest of the people in the network having to make an upgrade. And I think this is really the key distinction. A soft fork is a change that doesn't require others to do anything. A hard fork is a change where everybody has to move. And so everybody moving is really what can change the entire nature of the coin. Now, on the question of the market cap, I honestly don't think the market cap means anything, because you and I could program a Bitcoin, what do we call it? They've used every ridiculous name out there, but you know, Bitcoin 7.0, 3.2, let's call it. We could just program it right now, and we make 10 trillion coins, and I sell you one coin for $10. Here you go. Well, the market cap of my stupid coin is now $100 trillion. I'll quote Dr. Evil. And so Bitcoin's market cap has now become what now? What's Bitcoin's dominance now? It's 0.05% of the entire crypto market. Doesn't mean anything. You know, thousands of these coins are being created daily, and the market, in terms of the liquidity of them, is very, very tiny. Now we're at a point in the business cycle in general, in the economy overall, where the money is very easy. This is like 2005 or 2006, where, you know, housing is rising and the price of everything goes up and everything is returning very high investments. So, you know, it's possible for you and I with $10,000 to create a liquid, semi-liquid market, get it listed on a couple of exchanges and so on. And then it looks like we have a coin with a $100 million market cap over a few weeks of work. But of course, you know, as long as we have our money playing in that system, we can keep it going. But, you know, if we want to get our money out, then it comes crashing down. And I think, you know, if you look at this history of business cycles, it's easy money, and then when interest rates rise, everybody scrambles to go for the things that are the highest liquidity. We haven't seen that yet happen in the digital world, but I think when it gets to it, and eventually perhaps it will, you know, people are going to seek the things, people are not going to be looking for the thing that offers the highest return. They're not going to be speculating. They're going to be searching for the thing that offers the highest safety and the highest liquidity. And that's when, you know, that's when that's what's going to separate the men from the boys, if you want. At that point, you know, your coin that is listed on 2 exchanges in Korea and, you know, has a market cap of 100 million, suddenly that exchange has gone bankrupt and your coin doesn't work anymore and it's gone. And the people who have it are just trying their best to sell it to get into Bitcoin. So I don't think the market cap is a very meaningful metric because it can be gained, but also on a very fundamental level, I don't think it's meaningful because you can put all the coins together as being digital assets, crypto assets, projects, whatever innovations that people are playing with, whatever they want to do. But Bitcoin is different. It's a completely different project. Bitcoin is competing not with these coins. It's competing with the dollar and euro and Swiss franc and the IMF SDR and gold for international payment settlement. That's Bitcoin's market competition. It's not competing for smart contracts. It's not competing for all of these use cases that are being advertised by all these other coins. So I don't really see it as being a useful metric.
Thank you.
One question regarding the inflation issue. There is a lot of coins missing from Satoshi. Couldn't this work as a hidden inflation?
It could. We may yet see Satoshi come out tomorrow and say, surprise, I have 1 million coins, now they're worth, what, $8 billion?
He might be in the room.
Yeah, he might be in the room. And, you know, he might just go and buy himself a small little country and run it. Or, but you know what? He only has 1 billion coins. That's 1 million, or that's the most that he could probably have by any estimate. So that's still 5%. And if he starts spending it on buying himself his own little country and his own little army or whatever, he's not going to have any more coins left. It's problem solved. So, I mean, for me, it doesn't matter, to go back to the inequality issue, it really doesn't matter how much toys other people have, as long as they can't take my toys, you know, as long as they can't print, they don't have this magical machine that takes the value of my toys and puts it in theirs. So, yes, Satoshi could surprise us. He could turn out to just have done this as a way to get rich, and he could dump his coins, and maybe if he dumps the coins, the price drops all the way down to $100 or something like that. But will it affect Bitcoin fundamentally in the long run? I don't think so. In fact, if it happens, yeah, discounted coins, we can all buy cheap coins at $100 again, and then, you know, we start over again from the 100 and we start running again, but now we don't have to worry about Satoshi anymore.
So if I agree with most you said, but allow me to challenge a little bit further your Bitcoin maximalism. I wonder, to something being a standard, there seems to be more than just one aspect. And of course, a very important aspect is being a standard of settlements, thus being extinguisher of debt. And I think you seem to focus on that mostly. But a second aspect seems to be a standard for economic calculation, on which Hayek in his Denationalization of Money focused on exclusively, which led him to this monetarist kind scheme. And I think maybe a third aspect of a standard is being the generally accepted medium of exchange, which I'm not so sure theoretically if those different aspects always converge. So I'm wondering, are you sure that those aspects will converge, or do you see any place for something else than Bitcoin fulfilling, maybe just for a time, as silver next to gold, fulfilling to a better degree another aspect of that standard? And may there not even be use cases for blockchain-based tokens that have nothing to do with being a standard? We talked about anonymity before, but just the idea of tokenized certificates replacing shares and so on doesn't seem to be entirely related to this standard idea.
Okay, a lot of questions there. Let me first begin by the first one, Hayek's Denationalization of Money. So Hayek, towards the end, when he started saying, you know, I don't think gold would work as money, and what we need is private competing currencies, I don't find that convincing at all. I think, you know, his idea was that we would have a currency, and then you'd have, and the issuer of the currency backing it with other commodities, and they could choose whatever commodities so that they would guarantee the price. But I think, I mean, if anybody but Hayek said this, I would tell them, go read Hayek. So it's kind of problematic, because, you know, fundamentally, how do you, how do you place the things in the basket? But then if the price of those things goes up or goes down, and if it becomes the monetary medium itself, it will drive the production of those things itself. So if your basket is 30% copper, well, now copper is 30% of money. The production of copper is going to continue to increase until the value of your copper drops. In other words, actually, let me put it this way. Maybe Hayek was just doing this as a Trojan horse, because I think the real outcome of that competition is if we had free market where everybody was making their own currency backed by different commodities, there will be one winner, and that will be the free market provider whose currency is backed by gold. Previously, back at Hayek's day. Maybe this was just his Trojan horse. He was saying, you know, let's have a free market, and he knew that gold would win. Maybe not. Maybe he really believed that it's immaterial what he actually thought. But I think the reason gold won the monetary competition will not be annulled if you just had gold-backed instruments. So I think the same thing would happen. The second thing you asked in terms of what was it?
Other use cases than being a standard, yes, like tokens.
I mean, I've written a paper specifically about this, and it's a stupid thing to do because I'm trying to prove a negative, but so far it's held up pretty well. I mean, when I wrote this in 2014, I said, it may just be that the only use case for this blockchain technology is digital cash, and it may just be that the only workable digital cash for various historical reasons and economic incentives, that the only one that will actually be workable as physical cash is Bitcoin, and that's it. It might just be the case. And it looks like it, because all the other examples, I mean, there comes a point after you've spent hours trying to look at what is this structure of, you know, people are talking about putting stock markets on the blockchain, or putting identity on the blockchain, or putting real estate on the blockchain, or putting healthcare records. After a few hours of looking at all of these, you know, you get to a point where, you know, this doesn't make any sense. And then after seeing a few hundreds of them, they start looking a lot like the Nigerian prince emails that ask you to send them $10,000 and then they'll send you 15 million. I mean, I can't prove that if you keep replying to those Nigerian princes, I can't prove that one of them is not going to send you $15 million one day. There's definitely no way to prove that. Don't ask me to send my money, however. And I mean, this is a little bit of a joke of just sort of a meta way of understanding it, a sort of shortcut heuristic. But if you really want to look at it more concretely, a blockchain is a very complicated, bulky, expensive thing, and whose only advantage is that it allows us to move its own token, only its own token, without having to trust anybody. So we're burning all this electricity that Bitcoin burns, just so that when I move my Bitcoin to you, It moves to you, and it doesn't rely on anybody in the world. That's it. Now, I struggle to see, number one, I struggle to see any case where it would be so important for a transaction to be so trustless when it is attached to anything other than the token itself. In other words, if we're going to put real estate claims on the blockchain, making them immutable so that nobody changes, okay, what happens if I lose my private key to my house? Is the house gone forever? Is this going to be there? What if I lock myself in the house and I lost my private key? Am I going to just let myself starve there and not let anybody break the door and let me out? Obviously not. You know, at the end of the day, the private property in the house is going to be enforced by somebody with a gun or with a tank or with something, and they can break the house down and they can destroy the entire house. And guess what? Your blockchain is powerless in front of them. It can't do anything. The blockchain can just move its own little token. It can't tell you that this token is belonging to that house, and no, don't go into that house. It's powerless on top of that. So then if you're running a blockchain for housing records, it's still dependent on the person enforcing the housing property rights, whether it's the police or whatever. So why do you need all of this elaborate structure? And over time, you see that every single one of them is the same. And then the only thing that the blockchain can really do, that's it, is just moving its own native token. And it has to be its own native token because it has to be the one that rewards the miners. Because if the miners are getting rewarded in anything else, they have no incentive to maintain the integrity of the network. So all of these different pieces of the Bitcoin economic incentive puzzle, they fit together perfectly. Remove one of them, and the whole thing falls apart. So I can't really see any other use cases, and I've not really seen any that have been convincing. And after a while, I made this call, which is, nope, I don't see them. And at this point, you know, I don't argue about this anymore because I'm just waiting to see one commercial application of these things. It's astonishing. I've never seen anything get so much funding with so little output. I mean, billions have been spent on producing blockchain technology stuff, and yet Bitcoin is the only application. And all the other digital coins, to the extent that they do anything else, is just essentially copying the properties of Bitcoin. I mean, no coin has really innovated anything beyond the whole, you have a private key and you have a public key, and then there's a common ledger. That's really it. And that's the only thing that a blockchain can do. People would like to believe that, you know, we can just use it for all these other things. That whole meme of Bitcoin doesn't matter, but the blockchain technology thing does. Doesn't work. It's not how it works. It's the exact other way around. Blockchain technology is just a technical term that wasn't even used by anybody that refers to some sort of a structure within the way that makes Bitcoin work. It's only significant because it makes Bitcoin work. It's a cog in the Bitcoin machine. It's not the technology that can just be transferred to everything else. It's not the steam engine. It's not the internal combustion engine. But again, this is one of those things that only time will tell. So we'll see.
Okay, we have one more question in the back, and then we're going to wrap it up.
Good evening. Today, Mr. Andreas Antonopoulos was in Vienna, and he mentioned the importance of an open blockchain in comparison to a closed one, or private, or corrupt, or state-run. So my question is, how do you see the possibility of a crypto euro or crypto dollar? Can this actually happen? Can the member states of the EU really pull this off? Or do they only arguing and speaking and talking, and at the end of the day, they will never pull it off because they are incapable of it? So how do you see the possibility? And if we have a crypto euro, what do you think will be the acceptance among the people, and will it help Bitcoin, or will it be bad for Bitcoin?
I fundamentally don't think these projects of government-run cryptos can work, not because governments can't pull them off, just because they're completely unworkable from an engineering design. And the reason is very specific. The way that a cryptocurrency works is that the transaction is determined, the validity of the transaction is determined through cryptography, right? If you have the coins and you have the right private key, nothing in the world can stop you from moving your coins to my account, right? So And secondly, that the monetary policy is determined algorithmically, that there's no central bank sitting there and increasing the money supply and determining it, and that there's an algorithm that does that. Now, what is the raison d'etre of a central bank? Why do we even have central banks? It's precisely for those two things. Central banks want to stop you from making a payment if they want to stop it, and they want to be able to control the inflation and the issuance of the currency, to finance government, to whatever goals you want. But, you know, agree or disagree with these goals or not is besides the point. The point is that's what a central bank is for. They want to control transaction clearing, and they want to control monetary supply. So the notion that a central bank will build a cryptocurrency which neuters them, which removes from them the ability to control the transaction settlement and the monetary supply, I find to be completely self-defeating. I mean, if they really got to a point where they want to neuter themselves like that, they'll just use Bitcoin. And if they're going to continue, if they want to keep those forces, well, you know, the euro is, what, 70, 80% digital already? It's not that big of a difference. So the notion of making the euro a cryptocurrency by adding cryptography, it's either going to be a meaningless gimmick, or it's going to, if it's carried out, it's going to completely disempower central banks. So I can't see them ever pulling it off.
But in order to compete with cryptocurrencies and with Bitcoin, don't government currencies need to provide you the option of having your own private key and your own public key? And, you know, circumventing the banks?
I mean, I guess there's in my book, there's a section towards the end called How to Kill Bitcoin, a Beginner's Guide. And I go through a bunch of scenarios of how Bitcoin could be killed. And most of them you hear on the news, you know, 51% attack or something or the other. And I don't find any of the common attacks against Bitcoin to be a convincing possibility, for one very important reason. And I'm not a programmer, and I'm not very good at technical issues, but I see the one problem with all of these things is that what is needed to destroy Bitcoin is against the economic incentives of many, many, many people who will act against it. That's really what protects Bitcoin, is the fact that the economic incentive for people to use it drives them to innovate and find solutions and workarounds for whatever problems that others want to do for it. And so, while writing the book, I came up with, and you know, thinking this chapter through, I came up with what I think is maybe the most credible threat to Bitcoin. If you really wanted to kill Bitcoin, I think the answer is not to attack it or destroy it or to put people in jail or all that stuff. All of that stuff is just feeding Bitcoin. Because remember, Bitcoin, I mean, as Andreas himself calls it, it's the rat sewer. It's lived and grown off of all of these horrible things. And the more horrible things you do to it, the stronger it becomes. But you know what would really annoy the rat sewer? Put him in a 5-star hotel and clean him up, and then, you know, that's not his, that's a bad analogy. What I mean is, the way that you could kill the demand for Bitcoin is not to try and fight it, but to try to kill the economic incentives for it, to try to kill the reason that people want to use it. So, if you think Bitcoin is about cheap transactions or all of those things, then, you know, make business credit card fees lower. But I don't think that's the case. I think people use Bitcoin to escape inflation and to escape government control of money. So if you want to kill Bitcoin, I think a return to the 19th century gold standard, perhaps with added cryptographic security so that the central bank can't interfere with your supply. So, you know, they can't manage the money supply because the money supply is gold, and they can't manage your crypto, they can't tell you who to send your money to because it's all cryptographically determined by the validity of the private key. I think if governments moved towards that, it would seriously undermine demand for Bitcoin. I don't know if it would kill it though, because I still think in the long run, the hardness of producing it will likely mean it will probably outcompete gold in the long run, maybe. I don't know. It's impossible to make such predictions, but I think if you wanted to kill Bitcoin, this is probably your best bet. Gold and cryptography and going back to sound monetary system. And the advantage or the case that I could make for why this could kill Bitcoin is that, well, gold is far more distributed over the planet. Far more people know it. Far more people trust it and believe in it and understand it and have touched it. And then there are people who understand how Bitcoin works. Then there are people who can even begin to understand what it means for there to be digital money and cryptography and private keys and all of that stuff. And maybe that 6,000-year first mover advantage, maybe that might be enough to supplant the Bitcoin sort of faster confirmation times for Bitcoin transactions as opposed to gold transactions. But who knows? What we know is they're not going to try that for sure.
Well, I think that was a pretty good closing statement. We can maybe agree on meeting each other when you write your next book. You can start. You can start. You know, the return of the gold standard. How I didn't see that coming, or something like that.
Yes.
No.
I did see that coming.
You did see that. Yeah, exactly. That's the first chapter. And maybe we can meet again in Vienna, and then we'll see if they manage to kill Bitcoin, or if only Bitcoin Cash had to die. Saif, thank you very much. It was an extremely interesting evening. Have a good stay in Vienna. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me.